My sweet Lord. I really want to see you. Really want to be with you. Really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord. My sweet Lord. I really want to know you. I really want to go with you. Really want to show you, Lord, that it won't take long, my Lord.
George Harrison. Nicknamed the Quiet Beetle at the height of Beatlemania, George Harrison was indeed somewhat reserved compared to the other Beatles. He favored wit to Ringo's clowning, and he never indulged in either John's penchant for controversy or Paul's crowd-pleasing antics. George's measured and considered persona was reflected in his music, particularly in his clean-composed lead guitar parts, but also in his earliest songs for when he didn't seem to waste a line. With the introduction of psychedelics, spirituality, and Indian music in the mid-60s, his creative horizons expanded considerably, and he started to come into his own as a musician. He released a pair of experimental albums before he settled into a songwriting style that easily combined introspection with endearing melodies. He also developed a unique slide guitar technique that owed nothing to the blues. Later Beatles albums hinted at George's blossoming of talent. The White Album and Abbey Road contained some of his strongest work, with the latter including the standard Something, a song that's called the greatest love song of the past 50 years. Still, it wasn't until the 1970 release of All Things Must Pass, the post-Beatles triple album, that the general audience appreciated the depth of his talents. All Things Must Pass and its smash single, My Sweet Lord, a song that topped the charts around the world, cemented George's image as a superstar outside the Beatles, a reputation underscored by his 1971 superstar charity event, the Concert for Bangladesh, and 1973's Living in the Material World. His winning streak, though, hit some rough spots in the mid-70s with 1974's Dark Horse and 1975's Extra Texture, Read All About It. These albums slowed his momentum and led him to a respectable plateau where he stayed even after signing with his own record label, Dark Horse Records, in 1976 with the release of his album 33 1/3. Over the next 6 years, George recorded fairly steadily and racked up some hits as he slid into a relatively quiet phase, concentrating on raising his son, Danny, who was born to him and Olivia Harrison in 1978, and getting married to Olivia that same year. Also that same year, George started a film company, Handmade Films, with the intent of financing Monty Python's silver screen debut, Life of Brian. Though he did stay involved in music here and there, largely through live guest appearances popping up at charity concerts and tributes, and he also appeared on Dave Edmunds' oldies-inspired soundtrack for 1985's Porky's Revenge. George didn't have a fully fledged comeback until 1987's Jeff Lynne-produced Cloud 9. Thanks to the singles Got My Mind Set on You and When We Was Fab, the album became a top 10 hit around the world. Harrison quickly followed that record with the formation of the legendary supergroup the Traveling Wilburys, whose 1988 album, Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, grew out of solo sessions for a Harrison B-side. The group unfortunately turned out to be George's last hurrah. After their final album in 1990, George turned towards the Beatles' anthology reunion with Paul and Ringo, and then maintained a low social profile as he battled 2 types of cancer, tragically succumbing to lung cancer on November 29, 2001, about a month after the September 11th terrorist attacks. By that point, the world started to change drastically and rapidly. But his legacy as one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century was secure. Here we are 22 years later, in a world where George's music is more accessible than ever. having the sole writing credit for the Beatles' most popular song on Spotify, and the only Beatles song with over 1 billion streams, Here Comes the Sun, you may be led to think that George's songwriting is the most appreciated out of the 4 Beatles. However, I think that we've barely just begun the full appreciation and reevaluation that his work deserves. Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. I've often felt that George Harrison's post-Beatles solo music, with the exception of All Things Must Pass, is not discussed enough. With 12 studio albums, 10 if you don't count the experimental Wonderwall music and electronic sound, there are thousands of conversations to be had about George's 30-year career of truly amazing, introspective, thought-provoking, blissful, and sometimes outright bizarre music. And who better to invite to this conversation than two of the most intelligent and well-spoken and enthusiastic George Harrison fans that I can think of. I'd like to welcome back onto this podcast Elliot Roberts and Rob Sheffield, who both accepted their invitations to join this discussion very enthusiastically, which leads me to believe we have a lot of fantastic opinions to talk about. For those of you joining us for the first time, Elliot Roberts is a YouTuber from Australia whose Beatles-focused YouTube videos have become wildly popular, with some gaining nearly 1 million views, and his opinions around post-Beatles solo music have been held in great regard in the Beatles community. And Rob Sheffield is an actual legend in the world of music journalism. He's a contributing editor at Rolling Stone magazine, and his 2017 book Dreaming the Beatles is one of the most popular books about the Beatles, and is always the first book that I recommend to anyone who wants to know more about John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and their legacy. I'm so excited to see where this conversation goes, and the things we can discover about George Harrison and his beautiful solo music. Elliot and Rob, thank you both so much for being the first guests to make return appearances on the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. It is an honor to have you both on at the same time and discuss George Harrison in depth with you, especially considering that you both have worked on recent content about George. Elliot, you put out a nearly 3-hour-long video reviewing every George solo album. And Rob, you wrote a beautiful article describing the importance and awesomeness of George's album Living in the Material World. I'm just so excited to talk with you both.
Thank you for having me on. It's an honor to be here with you both. I'm very excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I'm very, very honored to be the Jeff Lynne in this Wilbury all-star team. But Jack and Elliot, I could not be more honored by the company. Thank you.
Well, I am incredibly honored by the fact that you both wanted to participate in this roundtable discussion where we give our takes on George's work and influence as a musician in 2023. And although some critics are starting to reevaluate George's contribution to music, so much of his best music still remains undiscovered by many, and I believe insufficiently discussed by nearly everyone. So, let's start this episode by diving right into the big question. What are your top 3 George Harrison albums?
Okay, well, considering I spent a lot of time, figuring this out myself, I can safely say that my 3 favorite, beginning with number 3, is his self-titled George Harrison album from, I believe, 1979. Yeah, just love that. I think it's one of his most underrated as well, followed by Living in the Material World, and then, of course, All Things Must Pass. I've never met anyone whose favorite George Harrison album is not All Things Must Pass, but who knows? Who knows? Rob might surprise us.
Yeah, honestly, because I've been listening so hard this spring to Living in the Material World that I briefly considered adopting a clever and contrarian pose that it is, in fact, better than All Things Must Pass. And yet that seems just, I'm not prepared even to go that far at this point. They're so different is the thing. They're so different. For me, number one, All Things Must Pass, not the most original decision in the world. Some people say that that's the best Beatles album. I used to argue against that. And yet I find that All Things Must Pass just grows over time. Which, we'll get into. Living in the Material World is an album that means more to me every year. It's very much, my arc with that is very much like with Abbey Road, that like loved it as a little kid, sort of faded out of my main interest for like my 20s and teens. And I have fallen madly back in love with it as an adult without really planning to. And Living in the Material World is just a huge record for me. My number 3 is appropriately 33 and a third from 1976, which is one of, as we'll discuss, the many, many, many George albums that people just don't even really know exists. And even people who love George Harrison don't happen to know about the existence of this record. And a few of his records fall into that category. This is one where there wasn't a hit that you can point people to as a way into the rest of the album, but it is always a delight for me to hear. And I know all three of us will have a lot to say about that album, but 33 and a third is a very strong number 3 for me.
I agree with both of you because my top 3 seem to be an average of both of yours. My number 1 is All Things Must Pass. Number 2 is George Harrison self-titled. And coming in at number 3 is 33 and a third. Wow. Again, polling in third place.
I feel like we've pissed a lot of people off by none of us having Cloud 9 in our top 3s. What I've learned from making that video is that people really love Cloud 9. And I think it's a good album. I think it's good. But yeah, I would agree with you. Even 33 and a third is better than Cloud 9 as well. It's just, I just think because that one was so popular and it was like his big kind of comeback record, it's just the record that people know. But if they knew the kind of songs that were in his late 70s output, they would reconsider because, yeah, as much as I think it's great, I think he was just doing more exciting stuff in the 70s.
That's an interesting one also because it intersects with so many stories. Yeah, so many, the Dylan story, the Petty story, the Roy Orbison story, just because that was when he was becoming a whole new type of LA rock star, which is funny because out of the Beatles, he was the only one who really pursued the role of an LA rock star. But I'm with you guys both on the self-titled 1979 album, which it would be my number 4 favorite. That's an absolutely beautiful album and very. I remember so vividly when nobody seemed to like that album. So I love that it's now sort of getting its due historically.
I think that I would rate Cloud 9 maybe 4 or 5 of his albums.
That might be a little further down in the pack for me.
Same. Yeah.
Really? Let's talk about that.
It's a great 1987 mainstream LA rock album with both the pluses and minuses of that particular genre. And some aspects of it have held up brilliantly, and some are a little limited by the production. And then there's a hit single that I just don't like at all. And sorry, I have tried many times over the years to find a nice word for Got My Mind Set on You. And alas, none of those words come to mind for me. I think it's one of the weakest Beatles solo singles in all 4 solo Beatles catalogs.
I think Weird Al put it best with his parody of it by just singing, "This song is just 6 words long." I mean, like yes. That's pretty much it. That's
really
what's happening
says
here.
It all. That says it all. It's really, everything about it is surprising. Nothing about it would suggest George Harrison to you. It's so funny that this is the guy who begins the 80s by singing songs like Unconsciousness Rules and Blood from a Clone, and how mainstream pop music is garbage because of the synthesizers and the dance beats. And then it's like the classic proverb of, choose your enemies wisely because that's who you turn into, because he became the biggest offender of all 4 Beatles with that regard. Got My Mind Set on You is a song that does not seem the least bit George Harrison like in either execution or imagination. To the point where I kind of admire it as a contrarian achievement. Have to be a real crank like George to steel your will to do something like that.
Absolutely. That's kind of what brings Cloud 9 down for me in like my ranking, is that I feel like I'm listening to George Harrison at a distance. Every other album he's created, he can't help but make it so personal, and he can't sing about things that he doesn't believe in, that aren't in his heart, and that's why I love him as an artist. And then suddenly with Cloud 9, it's just an LA rock album. It sounds a bit more generic of that time, and I still do not know why, at least where I live, my classic rock station, and pretty much any time I hear George Harrison on the radio, it's got my mind set on you. They have his whole discography to play of singles, and it's still just got my mind set on you. And I feel like it's just so limiting to the breadth of his discography that is mostly these days what people hear. Arguably one of his worst singles. Yeah.
It really is like if Spies Like Us became the song that Paul McCartney was most famous for.
Exactly. It would be absurd.
Not knocking what he did in the Beatles, but he really peaked with Spies Like Us. The songs, they don't sound a million miles apart either.
You can't even hear that song on streaming, I'm pretty sure, Spies Like Us. It's quite inaccessible to a modern audience, and perhaps it's for the best.
So let's keep talking about George's songs. Now that we've settled his worst, let's talk about his most underrated songs. Which 3 George songs do you both feel are his most underrated or undervalued?
All right, underrated. I would have to go with my number 1 and one of my favorite George Harrison songs, full stop, is Be Here Now from Living in the Material World. I just think that song transcends listening to music. I don't even know quite how to put it into words. In the video, I call it a magical song because I think that's what it makes me feel. It feels like he's accessed something higher in Be Here Now and communicates it so beautifully and so quietly and softly. It really is the best of what George Harrison was able to do musically. And it's the kind of song that is the most different to John or Paul in terms of their abilities and their talents. Yeah, that I don't know why more people aren't talking about Be Here Now. I just think it's so special and wonderful, and I genuinely tear up every time I hear it. It just has that ability to do that for me. And yeah, I would then say the opener of his self-titled Love Comes to Everyone. I know it's a bit cheesy with that clavinet and everything else, but there's such a good bass line on that song from Willie Weeks. It's just so happy. It kind of sets the tone of that album so well. Like you know that there's nothing too heavy here. It's just infectious soft rock with lush instrumentation, and things were happening nice for George at that time. He'd finally got a son. He was finally settled down with Olivia. He was going to Hawaii. He was tripping on magic mushrooms, and he was just feeling good. And you feel that when you listen to Love Comes to Everyone. It's a song I will put on to just feel better about myself and my day. And also from that album, there's actually quite a few I could pick, but I'm torn. I'm gonna go 2 more. You asked for 3. I'm gonna give you 4. I would say Your Love Is Forever from the same album. A song he was originally going to do as an instrumental, but he added lyrics, and it's just one of the best one of the best examples of George's profound gift for melody, I think. It's so simple. It's a beautiful guitar. It's just a stunning song. And finally, Life Itself from Somewhere in England. That is one of the few spiritual songs that was allowed to exist on that album after it was rejected by Warner Brothers, and he had to give up songs like Sat Singing for songs like Blood from a Clone and that. But Life Itself is George's spiritual vision set to music. It's where he unabashedly sings about the higher power in his life and what it means to him. It's kind of like a more rousing version of Be Here Now in a way. I just think when we allow George to sing about what truly means the most to him, that is when we are gifted with the best of what he's capable of. And so yeah, they're my picks.
Awesome picks, Elliot. Great choices.
Those are such great picks. And you know what? I had Be Here Now on my list too. But after hearing you describe it so beautifully, I'm not going to try to top that. So I'm swapping it out in my top three. My number 3 is a song called Cosmic Empire that George Harrison, making some of the mystic decisions for which the rest of us will always behold with mystery and wonder and shock, chose not to release. A song that he demoed for All Things Must Pass. And it's astounding when you listen to All Things Must Pass. And for years, the joke about the album was, triple album. You really should have cut it down to size. You listen to the demos that he recorded for that album in just a few days, just him and his acoustic guitar, sometimes with, like a friend playing along. And you realize that should have been a 5-record set because he had so many songs to put on it and he just couldn't fit them on. Cosmic Empire, a brilliant song that, quite frankly, any other singer-songwriter in 1970 would have been so proud to call his own. He would have not only released it on the album, he would have named the album after it, he would have released it as a single, and he would have retired and spent the rest of his career singing that as his greatest hit. George thought, I don't even have room for that on my 3-record set. It's a great example of like how many great songs that George Harrison had in him in that period. And with Cosmic Empire, there were so many from those sessions. Dehradun, which was a song that, of course, he wrote in Riki Cash's Beautiful Moment, where he's playing it in the anthology series. And Ringo says, I remember this one, after not hearing it for, all those years. But it triggers that beautiful, fond Beatles memory for Ringo of being in India, which we all thought Ringo didn't even remember fondly. Or Om Are Om, Gopala Krishna. So many amazing songs that could have been on that album and weren't. But to me, Cosmic Empire is just an absolute top tier George song. So that's my number 3. My number 2 is Here Comes the Moon, which, of course, a song that we all know and love from Elliot's beloved George Harrison self-titled album, which is so great. That's a song that people look at the title and they snicker and they think they have a clear idea what's going on in the song. No, it's not a joke. It's really not all that deeply connected to the other Here Comes the song that George happened to write about a heavenly body in the solar system. Here Comes the Moon is, as Elliot described that period, he's hanging out in Hawaii. He's happy in love. He's found peace with Olivia. He's sampling some of the local magic mushrooms. And Here Comes the Moon is just a song full of wonder. It's so full of 70s R&B. And the easiest thing to overlook about George's genius, whether it's the 60s or the 70s or later, is that he was always a huge fan of American R&B. And that was always what infused him as a singer, songwriter, and guitarist. Here Comes the Moon is a song that, honestly, it sounds like a Tom Bell, Philly soul kind of song, except it's unmistakably in that George sort of voice. And to me, that's just a beautiful, helpless song. He's putting the title there. He knows that it's going to punch people's buttons. He knows he's going to provoke people, but it's honestly just such a beautiful, gentle, meditative kind of song without being super verbal or super solemn. I think it's just like flat out unbelievably beautiful George Harrison song. Again, for a singer-songwriter of the 70s to have a song of that caliber that he isn't even going to put out as a single or even really ask people to listen to. And because Elliot chose 4, I'm going to sneak in my bonus pick before I get to number 1. And it's another song from Living in the Material World. No, actually, it's not. I switched that out. It's a song from an album that's kind of on a lower mystical plane, the Porky's Revenge soundtrack. But I Don't Want to Do It, a song that, of course, Bob Dylan, a Dylan song that, during the period where he and George were just hanging out, giving genius songs to each other that, again, anybody else in the business would have killed for these songs. And George and Bob just thought they were fun little things that they passed back and forth. With I Don't Want to Do It, it's a song that he demoed for All Things Must Pass, chose not to put on the album. Then after putting out records for years and years without putting that song on it, just he thought it couldn't liven up any of the spottier records that he was making. He kept that one and waited till the soundtrack of one of the cheesiest movies in Hollywood history, and then he did his incredibly beautiful version of I Don't Want to Do It. To me, that's George's perversity, his sense of humor, his eccentricity at its absolute maximum. And my number one most underrated George song, that's a very easy call for me. It's one of my very, very favorites. It's a song from the album 33 1/3, and it's called Pure Smokey. And that is a song that is also steeped in 70s R&B. It's not even a metaphor. He's singing about Smokey Robinson. He's singing about his hero. He's singing about the songwriter who made John and Paul want to be songwriters, which made George want to be a songwriter. They would flip through the record racks, and if they saw W. Robinson in the credits, they knew that this was a good song, just as they did with Goff and King or any of the other songwriters that they idolized. And Pure Smokey is such a beautiful song. George has a very clear awareness that the audience is not paying maximum attention to him right now. He's not trying to write a hit. He's not trying to write a big religious statement or philosophical statement, but he just sends up a very gentle prayer. He's thanking the Lord for giving the world Smokey Robinson. And what better thing could you thank the world for? And it's just really beautiful that he does this song, and he sounds so full of humor, and he's not trying very hard. He makes it sound effortless, and just this incredible soul beauty just pours out of his voice, out of his guitar, out of the chords. He's obviously been listening to a lot of Al Green and Willie Mitchell and Stevie Wonder. And to me, it just kind of sums up the genius of George Harrison, that he could put so much spiritual grace and so much humor into this song that he knows most people are going to overlook. But to me, Pure Smokey is one of the absolute most beautiful songs he or any of the Beatles ever wrote.
That ability of George's to create such incredible soul music, soul and R&B, was really something that I think you can really just point to George Harrison of the four Beatles in terms of talent and aptitude. You know, I love Paul McCartney. I love his musical output, but soul music was never really something that I think he was able to tackle as well as George Harrison. I think there was just something truly inside of George that allowed him to access that kind of soul and R&B potential. Yeah, great, really great picks.
Well, and it's funny that for all four Beatles, that whenever they were drifting and they felt like they'd lost their artistic inspiration, they could always come back to that, their first love that they shared, American R&B, American early rock and roll. Really beautiful how for all the Beatles, Smokey Robinson was such an icon, and that they all wrote songs that are so smitten with Smokey. I mean, it was something that they had consistently all through their solo careers. There's that great outtake from the White Album where they're trying to do an early version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and it's going great. It sounds phenomenal. And then George reaches for a high note and he can't hit it, and it just ruins the take. And everybody laughs, and he says, "Sorry, I tried doing a Smokey and I aren't Smokey." But that's one thing all the Beatles had in common. They idolized this music, and it always reminded them why they did what they did.
Absolutely.
Yeah, isn't it funny how much they changed and influenced music, that they actually never let go of their early influences like Smokey Robinson and Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley. And all of that music that George produced in like the mid to late 70s is filled with that soul, like you were talking about, Rob. One of my favorite tracks by George is Beautiful Girl, and that's a great example of that, I think. And that song, I believe, actually was first demoed during the All Things Must Pass sessions way back in 1970, which makes me think that like a 70s soulful kind of song like that was once a possible song for the Beatles, like many of the All Things Must Pass songs were.
It's very Rubber Soul, that song.
Yes.
It fits right into the kind of songwriting of Rubber Soul. And I think he started that singing about Patty, and then it ended up being a song about Olivia, which I think is interesting. A song that spans George's, two key women in his life. Yeah, gorgeous song. Also a wonderful guitar solo in Beautiful Girl. One of those ones that runs counter to the melody, and it's just like George creating an incredible song within an incredible song. Just something he was able to do so well with his slide guitar. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of George's slide guitar, my second favorite George Harrison song is Marwa Blues off of Brainwashed. I see that song as the rightful heir to the Be Here Now throne. It's very meditative.
Yeah.
It's so peaceful. It's so beautiful. And actually, in 2004, during an interview with Uncut magazine, Paul McCartney named Marwa Blues as one of his favorite songs of all time.
Wow.
The only songs on his iPod.
What a great pick. You're right about the connection with Be Here Now. Like, there's that beautiful, soulful sustain that it has, you know, the sense of the drone. Yeah, that's a beautiful song.
Yeah, absolutely. And another cool thing about that song is that it doesn't have any lyrics. It's almost like very Eastern in that sense, where there's little to no expression of ego or self in that song. It's just beautiful music. And then I have to say my favorite George song at this moment is Dark Sweet Lady off of George Harrison's Self-Titled.
What a great pick. What a beautiful song.
Great love song. Beautiful reflection of his love for Olivia and appreciation of where he was in life at that moment in time.
Another wonderful Spanish guitar solo as well. On that
Yeah.
song.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that we all had picks from that album. If you're listening to this podcast, go and listen to George Harrison's Self-Titled. Like, do you need more convincing that it is an underrated masterpiece?
It's so fun. I thought we were going to be able to argue about that album today, but looks like
No need.
looks like we're all crazy about it.
Oh yeah.
I just love that album.
Oh yeah, me too. There will be no tolerance for slander against either Self-Titled or 33 and a Third on this podcast.
These are all such fascinating takes. Life itself, like that's such a fantastic song that is very easily overlooked.
Yeah.
So easily overlooked. So much of that period of George's music, partly because he had no interest in also, I guess, marketing his new albums at that time. A lot of his music from the early 80s was about finishing up a contract with Warner Brothers so he could go and, work in his garden. But when he is tasked with creating music, and if you don't tell him to write songs about teenage love, he will create something like life itself. It's just really stunning.
Yeah. So now let's actually keep talking about great George songs, but through a new lens this time. Tell me the best song from your least favorite George Harrison album. Because, well, I don't think we've admitted our least favorite George album yet.
Well, okay. My least favorite album is Extra Texture, brackets. Read all about it. I understand what George is going for with this record. I like that he really dives into soul and R&B, but I think it has really muddy production. I think that the recent Dolby Atmos remasters have kind of improved it a bit, but the songs are just so dour, and you can tell he's not in a great place, which he wasn't. The albums always reflect George's state of mind, and he was in a pretty down place and even called that album grubby in later years. I just think it's a bit too sad. But that being said, I really love the opener, You. I mean, it's not a super complex song. It's just basically the words you and a few other, I, she pronouns scattered in there. And it was originally one going to be given to Ronnie Spector. And you can even hear her guide vocal, because she's got such a powerful voice, underneath George's own vocals when you listen to that song. I just think it's like a thunderous, propulsive banger of an opening number that just does not set the tone at all for what you're about to listen to. It almost pulls you into a false sense of victory and upbeatness that you're going to listen. And when you look at the album artwork as well, it's bright, it's orange, it's fun, it's funny. You open it up and there's George's face with "Oh, not him again" written inside. There's just, you feel like you're about to listen to something light, maybe a bit funny, a bit tongue in cheek, And then you listen to the rest of Extra Texture and you, in the words of, I think maybe World of Stone, you want to put a pistol to your brain. Like it is so depressing. So that's the thing. I hope I didn't get too dark there, but that is just the thing about Extra Texture. I think it just is. It's too dour and sad of an album for me to truly love. But I love the song "You." I think that's great.
I think that's a great pick. I have to admit, I love Extra Texture, and "You" is one of my least favorite songs on it.
Here we go. Now the discussion starts.
Perfect.
That's so funny. So my Extra Texture perspective could not be more opposite, because that song is full of, I mean, it's a very erratic album, to say the least. And it's got, and as so often with George in the 70s, the best moments are when he isn't trying very hard. So I tend to like the lazy songs on that album, like, "Ooh Baby, You Know That I Really Love You," which honestly,
that's a good track.
That's pretty much the entire lyrics right there. And that's another Smokey Robinson tribute that's really even more shameless, because it barely has any lyrics in it at all, except that he sweetly dedicates it to Smokey Robinson in the sleeve notes, I guess because he thought people wouldn't notice unless he mentioned it. But yeah, I love that album. The other one I'll defend is "Tired of Midnight Blue," which is, like you said, it's a depressing song. There's a lot of depressing stuff on that album, and you could accuse "Tired of Midnight Blue" of being depressing as well, but it's got a Steely Dan kind of feel in the music that I really like.
Good cowbell.
Very good cowbell. Very good cowbell. So, my least favorite George album. I have spent many, many, many years of my life trying to find something I like about "Somewhere in England." And I have failed so consistently. Life itself is one of the better moments on it. But this is an album, it's part of how it's marked in my history and the history of anybody who was around in the 80s, is so many people bought this album because it had a hit single on it, and because it had "All These Years Ago," which was a song that had very special resonance for people. It wasn't the greatest song in the world, and it wasn't necessarily the best John Lennon tribute in the world. And in fact, it wouldn't even really say that it was the kind of song that he would have played for John Lennon to his face and expected not to get a witheringly sarcastic comment about it. You can understand why it was a hit at the time and why it meant something to people. But as a result, almost everybody in the 80s had "Somewhere in England" in their record collection. And so people tried really hard to listen to that whole album. So at least "Gone Troppo," that was an album that came out and people realized that was classic case of sometimes you can judge a book by the cover. You look at the cover of the album and you know exactly every terrible decision that has gone into that album. And you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I love the version of "Circles" that ends that album, which of course is a brilliant outtake from the White Album. And I even thought of having that as my favorite song from the worst George album. But I figured "Circles," it's really a George Beatles song, and it's cheating to have that as to count that as like the best song on his worst album. Whereas honestly, the song that is my favorite song on "Somewhere in England" is a Hoagy Carmichael song, "Baltimore Oriole." And I'm not saying it's even a great Hoagy Carmichael song, but it's a nice Hoagy Carmichael song. And the key is George isn't trying very hard when he sings it. And that's a real problem with George often in this period, which is he oversins when he knows that the material is not up to snuff. And "Baltimore Oriole," he figures, well, at least here's a song where it's a good melody, it's a good lyric, I can relax, and it actually sounds like he's having fun for just a few minutes of that album, and then it's over. And so I got to go with "Baltimore Oriole," which isn't even a George composition, but to my mind and to my ears, that's the best he does on "Somewhere in England." I'm very grateful that you gave me a new perspective on life itself. So I'm really hoping that I'm going to fall for that one in the same way. But again, also talk about what you said about George not marketing his strengths, perhaps with ideal shrewdness, because that album begins with two of the worst songs that any of the Beatles ever wrote, "Blood from a Clone" and "Unconsciousness Rules." When those are the first two songs on your album, you're basically saying, hey, I know all you teenagers who bought this record suck. Your taste in music sucks. Go back and listen to your disco, your new wave, or whatever you're listening to. And honestly, it takes real perseverance to continue past the first two songs.
Yeah, he's really in his curmudgeon era on Somewhere in England. It's like Blood from a Clone is a song knocking the music industry, and then right after Unconsciousness Rules is knocking all the people that then consume the songs of the same music industry. It's like a 1-2 punch of how he feels about being a recording artist in the early 80s and what, the idea of creating music is for him. I think Unconsciousness Rules musically is still a lot of fun. I think the band's putting in a ton of effort to at least make it a bit, upbeat and danceable. But yeah, it is hard to get past the rather nihilistic lyrics. I will give you that. Also,
if George isn't necessarily making the best case for his own philosophy of music, as, like if he's singing about how he's better than Olivia Newton-John and the Pointer Sisters or whoever he means in like these songs, he's not really up to their standards. So it's a case where he's really sort of undercutting his own argument. Something I love about Baltimore Oriole is the connection with Ringo, because I happen to be a big fan of Ringo's sentimental journey, as maybe you guys are too. I love Ringo's version of Stardust, the most famous and most beloved Hoagie Carmichael song. And so I think of sort of that era of solo Beatles that begins with Ringo singing Stardust and ends with George singing Baltimore Oriole. Something really kind of beautiful in that they're both singing about birds and they're both singing these old songs that their moms loved. And, there's a sweet connection there.
That's really nice. Yeah.
Don Troppo, not very good. Not very good, is it? I'm hoping somebody will have a contrary defense of Don Troppo to give me a new perspective on it.
Gone Troppo was my least favorite album back in the day. I just couldn't see much at all that was redeemable of it. I don't mind That's the Way It Goes as a song. It's a little defeatist, and I'm still perplexed as to why it was one of the few songs not from All Things Must Pass or Living in the Material World that made it to the Concert for George. Possibly the most random pick. I think Joe Brown sings it, and you just think about all the other songs that could have been performed, even something from Cloud 9, but no, it's That's the Way It Goes. So maybe that meant something extra special to George. I'm not sure. I think Mystical One, when you listen to his acoustic demo of that song, that's on, it's like a bonus track on the album. It's really lovely. You listen to his original demo of Mystical One, it will give you an entirely different outlook on it. You strip away all the, cheesy 80s gloss and the vocoder and the strange backup singers, all those odd effects that album has, and you listen to just him talking, him singing. It's quite beautiful. I really do like that track, stripped down to its bones. And Unknown Delight, one of the only songs he ever wrote about his child. There's something quite special there. I think the thing about Gone Troppo is that it was an album made out of, obligation, with glimmers of flashes of brilliance and a wee bit of potential. But overall, the thing doesn't coalesce. But there are moments. Circles as well is, I think, a very cool, if very strange, moment in the album. I've said before, there's no way to clear a room quicker than putting on the song Circles. I think if you needed people to go home, you'd put that song on, because it's scary as well. It's a scary and spooky song. Yeah, otherwise you've got like Grease, which is basically an instrumental throwaway. My least favorite George Harrison song, Baby Don't Run Away. Oh my goodness, that's just terrible. Yeah, I'm just looking at the track list now. I Really Love You doesn't even sound like a George Harrison song. His voice isn't even the key melody line. And Wake Up My Love is really a hack piece. If you boil it down, it's, making a similar to what was that other song that Warner Brothers made him write? Similar to Teardrops from Somewhere in England. Just these songs written with, a punchy chorus, vague lyrics about, love and that kind of thing. Yeah, Gone Troppo, I think, is worth a listen just because of how bizarre and batshit crazy it is, like the album artwork. But yeah, not one of his finest moments.
I think Gone Troppo is a really interesting album, and I say that because I think in terms of songwriting, there are some really good songs on there.
Yeah.
For example, I think if you took like the cheesy synths and Star Wars-esque laser sounds out of Wake Up My Love, you'd have a great pop song. I mean, it's kind of catchy, but overall, Rob, I think you're right. There's just bad decisions all around with this album, especially when it comes to the wacky and zany overproduction of these songs, which gives all the songs like this off-balanced circusy feel. Which is too bad because I really do think the writing is there.
Yeah, I think Pipes of Peace is generally a much better album than Gone Troppo, but I do liken it to his Pipes of Peace. It was made around the same time. Both albums have kind of a silly, zany quality to them that I guess was just something in the water in 1982, 1983, is that ex-Beatles were just, wanting to get a little too whimsical, I think. And I can't even recall what that album would have been in Ringo's discography, what he was making. Was it Stop and Smell the Roses? I'm not sure.
Old Wave.
Old Wave. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, just something strange about that early 80s periods in the Beatles, the post-John Lennon period. Yeah.
It must have been really hard as a classic rock musician in the 80s. I mean, that was a time where the world and music was changing very quickly, and you had all this new technology in the studio and new sounds that were popular, but totally foreign to you. And any embracement of those sounds would make you seem like a sellout, but also any rejection of them would render your music obsolete. So it must have been a difficult position as an artist to try to decide and make decisions on what to do next.
Yeah, also, it requires a skill set that many of them simply did not have. Honestly, you look at the wreckage of the 60s rock legends and the albums they made in 81, 82, 83, and it's a sorry roll call that unfortunately includes like Gone Troppo and Somewhere in England. That those are both, as Elliot said, those are albums of a guy who hates his job. He wants to get back and do his gardening. This is an annoying interruption of his garden time. But you look at a lot of the albums that some of the most famous rock stars were making in 1982, and gosh, you look at that Who album, It's Hard, with the video game on the cover, and you listen through that album. It's funny because Pete Townsend was writing great songs at that time. He put most of them on his solo album that year, and listen to It's Hard and think, wow, one of the biggest, most popular bands in the world released this album and like really, really expected people to buy it just because it was them. And there was a lot of that going around in the old school rockers of that era. And some of them felt out of their depth because they weren't really up to responding to the challenge in the way that some of them were. But a lot of them weren't, and George certainly didn't feel he was.
I think the reason why Paul McCartney fared a little bit better in the early 80s with Tug of War and even Pipes of Peace is that I think he was at least attempting at harnessing that sound of, the early 80s. But I mean, particularly with McCartney 2, that's one of my favorite Paul McCartney albums. I love McCartney 2, and it's an embracing of, synths and odd technologies, whereas George Harrison, I watched a lot of interviews with him around this time, as much as there is, which there aren't a lot because again he wasn't doing a lot of press. So I think I've seen everything he's done in terms of interviews, and what really sticks out is his total aversion to any other kind of musical genre. There's an interview on Good Morning Australia in 1982 where he's in northern Queensland soaking up the sun, And the interviewer is asking him about, what else is he listening to at the moment? What else do you like? And he genuinely can't really think of any. He calls Bob Dylan the governor and that everyone should just listen to him. And he muses Elton John for a moment and then 1 second after continues to just, belittle his sound and his songwriting, and it just didn't seem like George was doing himself any favors and was even attempting to enjoy or appreciate any of the music from around that time. And don't even get me started on punk. He hated punk with a seething passion, and I think was part of why the UK stopped embracing him so much, is that his fun R&B American style of music was just so at odds with what they were listening to in the UK. So yeah, I do wonder if George had embraced the more popular sounds of the time, what kind of things he could create, because I think he did limit himself in that way.
Yes, and I know that his disdain for new music even continued into the 90s. He spoke out against U2 and Oasis and the Spice Girls.
Didn't love Oasis.
I think he hated that the ego was the main focus in those new bands.
I'm genuinely not sure, like, what I think Eurythmics, I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, but Eurythmics was an inspiration for one of the songs on Cloud 9. But otherwise, I don't think there was much in the. Do you know, Rob, if there was anything or anything you can hear in George's music that?
No, I think he was a quintessential baby boomer who stopped listening to music at a certain point in his life, and certainly thought by the end of the 70s that he had really no interest in it. And I think that kind of bitterness really leaves a lot of sourness on his early 80s records. And in the late 80s with Cloud 9 and the Traveling Wilburys, he got so much of his enthusiasm back just by having a circle of friends who were making records with him. So much of that coming down to Jeff Lynne, of course. But it's definitely a case where he was someone who stopped being a music fan. And honestly, like, it's weird that the other Beatles who are not Paul McCartney are confronted with someone who is such a superhuman music fan. Whatever the kids are into right now, Paul McCartney is not only a fan of it, he's not only listening to it, he's like trying to do his own version of it. So, when punk rock and new wave comes out, we could argue all day about how well he did stuff like that with something like, Old Siam, Sir. I happen to be a big Back to the Egg partisan.
Yes.
But I love Back to the Egg.
I love Back to the Egg, right? Like, there's no way that George could have made a Back to the Egg. He would have seen that as like too much of a challenge to him. In many ways, why he was inspired by the whole Traveling Wilburys project was they said, let's do this kind of stuff and not mess with what the kids are into these days. And yet Paul, because of his personality, he always wants to do what the kids are doing these days. He still does. That's why he loves doing stuff like 4 or 5 seconds from Wilden, his Rihanna and Kanye song. He loves that song. He loves to do it live. He loves that he has a top 10 song that he can bust out live. And that's something that was obviously very difficult for the other Beatles to live with, because how are you supposed to compete when Paul is such a innate, enthusiastic fan of new music? And for John and George especially, but also Ringo, it was just exhausting to try to keep up with that.
Yeah. So while we're on the subject of Paul's affinity for always wanting to participate in contemporary music trends, this might be a good time to bring up the recent big news that came out the other week, that a new Beatles track, the final Beatles song, will be released this year. That is according to Paul McCartney himself. And right now, headlines are describing the song like it's going to be another example of Paul embracing this AI trend in music where, we can make new songs sound like they're being sung by artists who are no longer with us. But I think that the use of artificial intelligence in this new Beatles song is going to be more along the lines of how they used AI in Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary, where they're able to remove all excess noises from the track and make the original take sound fresh and clean. But I'd love to get your thoughts on this new song that's going to be coming out this year.
Yeah, I think it's when we read AI, it's merely the machine learning technology that was used in Get Back to, separate a guitar, vocals, drums from a very muddy, otherwise muddy mix, something that they didn't have the ability to do on the anthology when they made Free as a Bird and Real Love. They listened to Now and Then, which is the song that we all believe it is, unless he's going to pull a fast one on us and release Carnival of Light. But I believe it's Now and Then. And Paul actually said in, I think, a BBC interview later on that they listened to it and George was saying, "Oh, it's fucking rubbish, this, just not into it." And Paul was like, "No, George, this is John." But because the Beatles are a democracy, they didn't want to do it. But the reasons why it was quote unquote fucking rubbish from George may be because of the quality of the recording. Those home demos of John's didn't sound that great. But now with technology, perhaps they can be dusted off and put to good use. I mean, I know there's also another clip from George where he says, "I hope someone, takes my old crap demos and turns them into hit records." He said that around the time of Anthology. So I think that is license for this song to come out. I know it's a bit contentious amongst fans that, they're not getting the say of all four of them or even three of them, but I'm very excited for it to come out. And I think, they're not going to create, I don't think they're going to create new vocals of John's using AI. I think that would be quite morbid, but I really don't think that that's what's going on here at all. I think they're just cleaning up an older demo.
Yeah, I think the headlines have been so trying to frighten people, and also the familiar headlines trying to demonize Paul by saying, "Look what he's doing now. He's using HAL 9000 to create a fake Beatles song." So I'm determined to make up my mind about this when I actually hear the results, because, I've been listening to bad Beatles imitations as long as there have been bad Beatles imitations. And, whatever the technology used to make bad Beatles imitations, nobody's ever had any trouble hearing the difference between the Beatles and the real thing. I don't think anybody has to worry that somebody will use AI, which is very vague and confusing and elusive term, especially in a context like this, since this is technology that, like you said, is, machine learning has been around for a while. But the whole idea that, I don't think we need to worry about somebody fabricating Beatles songs that we won't be able to tell from the real thing, because it's pretty well documented that many brilliant minds have spent their entire careers trying to duplicate the magic of the Beatles artificially, and it cannot be done. Honestly, if the Bee Gees couldn't do it with the Sgt. Pepper movie, it'll never be done. I always smile when I think of what Robin Gibb said, that when our Sgt. Pepper comes out, it will be as if theirs never existed. I mean, he actually said this and he believed it, and the thing is, like, for people to have that same fear now that, there's going to be an artificial version of the Beatles that's going to replace the real thing, there's no reason at all to be worried about that. But I guess you can't tell people not to use these scare headlines when they are so effective at punching people's buttons.
Totally.
I agree. I think if this is Now and Then, and all they're doing is cleaning up the original track, then I'm actually really excited for this to come out. And Elliot, I think you're right. I think George might have liked the song, but I mean, we know that the issue he commented on was its sound. I mean, who really knows why he didn't want to keep working on it? Maybe he was just tired of having to see Paul in the studio at that point.
Possibly.
I don't know what could give you that idea.
Also, I love that one moment in the anthology sessions where George and Ringo are already in the studio, and then Paul walks in wearing a leather jacket, spots the camera immediately with his huge persona filling up the room, and then George deflates the whole persona in like 2 seconds, and he's like, "Is that a vegetarian leather jacket?"
Vegetarian leather jacket. Yeah? Yes.
And then Paul's just kind of speechless and laughs, and he's like, "Yeah." And yeah, suddenly they're back on equal ground, and love that.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Speaking of Paul and George working together post-Beatles, how do you think George's relationships with himself, with each of the Beatles, and with the idea of the Beatles changed since their breakup, like 1970, All Things Must Pass?
I'm interested to hear your take on this first, Rob.
It was very difficult for George to keep making music with that level of enthusiasm. And one of the weird things is, when you look at the period of Living the Material World and All Things Must Pass and the concert for Bangladesh, when he was arguably the most popular Beatle, he was the one seen as sort of transcending the bickering and fighting at the end of the game. He was the one who was moving on, who was proving his musicianship. He was really on top of the world in the 70s. And it's really bizarre how quickly he fell off between Material World and Dark Horse, albums that people often link together if they're just looking at George's catalog from a distance, when they sound like they were recorded by two completely different musicians with completely different goals and completely different audiences. It's honestly strange that those albums are so linked together when they were just a year apart, but they're a universe apart. And Living the Material World, he's got that enthusiasm for music, and obviously a lot of the joy has gone out of his life and out of his music by the time he's doing Dark Horse. He's doing it for the money, and there's no pretense that he's not doing it for the money. He's doing this album while he has a case of laryngitis, which is an innovation that I don't think anybody else has ever imitated. With all the many things that people imitate about George Harrison, nobody does that. Why don't we make an album while we have literally laryngitis? And it's just because he had to do the album on schedule if he was going to use it to promote his tour. And just the cynicism of it, also connected with the drugs and what was going on in his personal life. Just the fun went out of it very quickly for him. And George, more than any of the other Beatles, found it very difficult to fake it. It's something very fascinating about George is the quality of his vocals is always commensurate with the quality of the song, because he was not facile enough as an actor to fake it. He couldn't do, with all the other Beatles, we have great examples of them doing great vocal performances on terrible songs. Let's face it, they all did that. And George, you just don't have that, because it's almost like his throat is almost like a conscience. His throat is like, you want me to sing something like Simply Shady? No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to get laryngitis rather than go into a studio and sing that song. And I think with George, just so much of the fun went out of it that he had to sort of step back and let the enthusiasm for music, which anybody can hear renewed in the late 80s, he had to wait for that enthusiasm to come back, because he couldn't just hack his way through it. As it turned out, when he tried to be a hack, he just wasn't a very good hack. George, for better, for worse, he never learned how to fake it.
Yeah. I'd like to know, where does Dark Horse sit for you in terms of, a loose album ranking? Are you a fan of it?
No, in fact, I think it's even worse than Somewhere in England.
There you go.
Yeah. It's the difference is that, given the place of Somewhere in England with having a hit attached to it, it's an album that I've spent many, 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 many hours listening to and not enjoying. Whereas Dark Horse is an album that, you listen to it once and you know exactly what's going on. It's not going to grow on you. This is a rock star who has a big financial incentive to deliver an album on time. And the fact that he can't sing, that physically he cannot sing these songs, that doesn't enter into his schedule at all. He's going to do the album even when he knows that it isn't coming out good. And even when he knows that it's not up to the standards that he usually sets for his art. And you can hear like a lot of that on the record. It's very sour. And that sourness really stayed with his music for a very long time, definitely like peaking in the early 80s, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's moments on Dark Horse that I have come to really love. I think the opener is great. Harry's on tour, especially when they recreate it live. I think it really pops off. I think there's the kind of vulnerability and intimacy of a song like Simply Shady and So Sad, even though they are depressing songs. I think there is something there. I mean, someone who it does always strike me as so strange. Someone who wanted to be so private and was, he kept his cards close to his chest in terms of his private life. But here he was just spilling his guts out. He always likened it to Peyton Place or other, soap operas at the time. And I think there's something to that I find quite special about Dark Horse, that it's unlike any of his other albums. And there are a few songs on there that he recorded before his bout of laryngitis. Like, I think Far East Man, I think it was starting to happen then, but even then, I think that shows his potential for soul music that I quite enjoy. I enjoy it more than Ronnie Wood's version, as they wrote that together. And Dark Horse, the song itself, I think is good, despite it sounding the worst on the album. And Ding Dong Ding Dong is always a New Year's Eve favorite. If someone puts that on, they're a friend in my book, because it is so obscure. But I'll always feel like listening to it come December 31st. Yeah, I think that sourness did stay with George for a lot of his career, and I think that when someone would bring up a Beatles reunion or whatever the heck Paul McCartney was doing at the time, it never helped, because really Paul and George only diverted further as their careers went on. Their interests and what being a musician meant to them kept becoming very, very disparate things. Paul always wanted to create, a hit album. He always wanted to stay relevant with his music. And I think that there was, a part of that George resented. He even said, when the backlash came out about his Dark Horse tour, he said, well, look, if you want to, or it might have even been later, he said,
no, it was then. If you want to hear, it was early in that tour.
Yeah. He said, if you want to hear a Beatles song, go listen to Wings. And it's like, like he was throwing shade very, very, very early on, in a way that the kind of playfulness of John and Paul, when they were butting heads earlier in the 70s, there was something quite like, oh, these two misunderstood songwriting partners. But with George, it really just felt like pure resentment of whatever the heck Paul was doing or attempting to do. I think as the years went on, they kind of got over that a bit, and they had moments where they were together. I wish there was footage from Eric Clapton's wedding of George, Paul, and Ringo playing. Like, that's kind of the Beatles, the long lost Beatles gig that we'll never know about. Even though they played like 2 or 3 songs or whatever, it's still notable. It's still very significant. Yeah, I would always like to think that the bluster of that relationship of George and Paul, kind of the two polar opposites of the post-Beatles world, was mostly bluster. I hope that the dinners that they had in their later years and their ability to kind of reflect on it with, I don't know. Yeah, I just hope it was they were able to mend things up and find common ground more than we would perhaps like to think.
It's true. And that is, I mean, it's interesting that, you look at 1973, especially, what an incredibly fascinating Beatles year that is. John, George, and Ringo are together socially an awful lot of the time in LA. There's the great moment. I wish we had footage of this even more than Eric Clapton's wedding, with them playing with Eric Clapton. But 1973, they go to a party at Barbra Streisand's place in Beverly Hills. And it's a political benefit. Hugh Hefner is there. Lots of movie stars are there. Lots of directors are there in the room. And people are calling and making pledges. And somebody pledges a certain amount of money. It turns out to be $3,000. And this is before that was a joke on Saturday Night Live. So maybe Lorne Michaels was there at this party too. But if the 3 Beatles who were there will sing "With a Little Help from My Friends," and Barbra Streisand says, like, oh, no, they're tired, they're rusty. So she sings it, which is very gallant of her, being a very good hostess. But then she and George stay up all night until dawn, talking about songs for her next album that she wants him to write. And they're eating the hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen. That, to me, that is footage I would love to watch. I would love that as a sequel to Two of Us. Just George and Barbra Streisand sitting in the kitchen of her mansion. I love that because it's a moment where it's really kind of a last moment for George in the 70s, where he really sees a huge high-profile pop career as something that he actually wants, and that is something that he embraces rather than flees from. And it's just fascinating in the way that with all all three of the Beatles who weren't Paul, how confused they were in 1973 and for many years afterwards by the fact that the world still loves the Beatles so much. And whereas it seemed Paul was a little more unsurprised by that. Paul was like, of course, people still love the Beatles. Whereas the other three, especially when you get, 1973, you get the Red and Blue albums coming out, the 1962, 66 and the 1967, 1970 compilations, which are blockbuster sales phenomenons. And like all the Beatles are really surprised and weirded out by the fact that they're so popular, that these are songs that are so old. And for George, it's both inspiring and threatening. And there's something kind of beautiful about the sort of inspiration that had for him.
Yeah, I think that the awareness of the Beatles' music still being big and popular is definitely there on Living in the Material World from 1973. I think it's the title track. George directly mentions John, Paul, and Ringo, and he kind of breaks that fourth wall between him and the audience. And I assume that mention meant that he was on good terms with them, or at least not bad terms.
I don't know. Sometimes I listen to that song and I do think that, but other times I think what he's communicating with that song is that we're stuck here in the material world. I think that's one of the last lyrics he sings in that song, that this is not really where we want to be. There is something better. That's not the material world. It's the spiritual world. It's the astral world. And that's what George is, especially with that album, attempting to reach. And it's the last real effort where he wants his listeners. He believes perhaps he can convince his listeners and his fans that this is actually, the way to go. John and Paul here in the material world. That's not it. I think it's playful, and I don't think I think it is a bit vague which way it goes, even with we got Richie on the tour. It's very funny. It's very cute. But I also think that he's pointing out something, that the troubles and the things we go through in the material world aren't where it's at. That's my take on it. I don't know. I think there could be 100 different versions of what the inclusion of the other Beatles names means in that song.
Sure, it's very fascinating. It's like you said, it's a very vague moment. He's almost ambivalent about it. He doesn't go all the way and make it. I mean, to me, it's a really kind of sweet shout out. He's obviously in a very dark and confused place when he does that song. Funny because he doesn't have anything really to say in that song about the spiritual world. He just can't stop talking about how much he resents being in the material world, frustrated in the material world, like I can't say what I'm doing here, and he's really upset about the fact that he's trapped in the material world. And it's really kind of funny that in the middle of this, really lost and very dour and very kind of vague sort of song, he finds one human connection that brings some sort of meaning to his journey in life, to his being a human being, being in the material world. And that's his connection to John and Paul and Richie. And it's a really sweet moment that you could definitely tell he's not really sure how he feels about it. And that, I guess, to me is what makes it so beautiful, that he's sort of he's thinking out loud to the listener and saying, look, I don't know what this means. Is this something I should be glad about or not? It's funny because he knows that the listener who might have maybe dozed off in the first half of that song is going to suddenly wake up and go, wait, he's singing about John and Paul. And there, he just called Ringo Richie. This is at a time when nobody knows that Ringo is called Richie. Like none of the millions of people who bought that album were familiar with the idea that Richie was Ringo's name. And Richie is right there in the room playing drums on the song. It's a very sweet moment, and a moment where you have a sense of, he's like, the only people who I feel any common connection to right now are the three Beatles, who I have this gigantic, messy, chaotic relationship with that I've already been complaining about earlier on the album. And there's something really beautiful about that. It's like the beautiful moment every night on his 1974 tour, what he would do In My Life. And you could hear in every single performance of that he is really deeply conflicted about having been a Beatle. And he's like, I know that people are going to like this if I sing In My Life, that this is going to be their favorite moment of the show. And I don't know what I feel about that. He's obviously very ambivalent, but it's always got a sweet moment at the end where he says, and it always sounds very sincere when he says, I want to dedicate that to John and Paul and Ringo and the X's. Sometimes he says just the X's. Sometimes he singles out John for writing the song. But it's always really beautiful that he's got this personal memory that he's making part of the show. And Elliot, like you said, he's a very private person. This doesn't come naturally to him. And yet he's openly ambivalent and conflicted about what it means.
Yeah, absolutely.
This actually leads me into the next topic that I'd love to discuss with you guys, because upon its release, Living in the Material World didn't live up to critics' expectations, especially following All Things Must Pass. A big criticism of Living in the Material World was that it was too preachy or too spiritual at points. Now, how do you guys think that spirituality and George's opinion on world events played a role in his music and career? Do you find that it's all too much sometimes, and think that it sometimes ruins what's otherwise a great musical moment? Or do you think that it actually enhances his music, allowing the listener to become more familiar with, his beliefs and closer to who he is?
I mean, I said this before. I think it's George's best moments in music is where he's allowed to just sing what's in his heart and sing, create his spiritual visions and set it to music. I think that's the best George Harrison, because even though he wrote other songs about other things, he wrote songs about Olivia, he wrote, whatever it might be, he needed to write songs about what the things that meant something to him, and that meant the most to him. So therefore, I think we get some of his best music. And I think that in Living in the Material World, the fact that it was so spiritual, and I understand people at the time thinking it's a bit preachy, especially because he was top dog at that point. He'd had All Things Must Pass. He was kind of winning the post-Beatles, like game of favorites. Everyone loved George. And to hear him kind of proselytizing and almost telling people off in that album, even though I think it's misunderstood and that he's really telling himself those things. He says it in I Me Mine, that his semi-autobiography, that he's reminding himself of all those things in those songs, as well as other people. And I think the world needed that. I certainly wasn't alive around the time, but in the early 70s, it's Richard Nixon, it's the kind of end of the Vietnam War, it's the world wasn't really in a great place. And that, divine kind of utopia that was attempting to be created in the late 60s was really kind of dying off by 1973. The world was getting more cynical. The me generation was beginning. But George Harrison was one of the few artists that didn't forget, that message. Even though he seemed to want to distance himself from the Beatles, he fought to preserve their greatest message, being love, give me love. And I think that above, all the other preaching is what I take away from Living in the Material World, is that he was at least attempting to carry through what he deemed to be as the greatest thing to come out of the 60s. And that's why I will always love that record, and I will always defend those songs.
Yeah, I love so much of George's spirituality, to me, comes out in the way he plays guitar on a song like Give Me Love. Honestly, also just to hear his effect on the other musicians, just Nicky Hopkins. And we could talk all day about Nicky Hopkins and what he brought to like all the Beatles solo careers. Can't imagine without him. You can't imagine Ringo without him. You certainly can't imagine Material World without him. And especially in Give Me Love, he's playing so beautifully. Klaus Forman is playing so beautifully. And there's just something about how uplifting that song is. To me, that's George's spirituality coming through, the way it does in a song like Blow Away, or the way it does in a song like Pure Smoky, or the way it does in a song like Apple Scruffs. He also shows a very different sort of preachy church lady side on that album, which is extremely tiresome, brings out like the thinness of his voice. It's weird that I was mentioning before, George always sings his great songs well and sings his bad songs beautifully. It's like his voice can hear the difference. And you can hear in some of the songs where he gets really preachy that, his heart might be in it, but his voice is not in it. And that there's definitely like something you can definitely tell why the millions of people who bought this album thought, like, we love this guy. We want to hear him sing something like Give Me Love. We want to hear him sing something like, Don't Let Me Wait Too Long or Be Here Now, these beautiful songs. But when he gets preachy and starts talking about sinfulness and just not even getting into the issue of his personal life and the sort of the glass house that he was in and how it's probably better for him and better for the world that nobody really knew, like about a lot of what was going on with George at that time. But certainly it's hard to go back to that and feel, for me anyway, as a listener, to feel much warmth for those songs. But you can also feel his sort of sense of futility and overall struggle that he really, when he says, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I hope to see much clear in living the material world. He doesn't sound like he has a lot of hope, and he also doesn't sound like he has a lot to say to people, but he's trying to figure it out with his music. And to me, it seems like the music is carrying him through. I mean, living the material world is, such a beautiful sound. It's a groove album. It's the stripped down small band, trusted friends making music in Friar Park, and just the warmth and communal spirit of that album. That to me is the real spiritual message of it. And then the preachy lyrics got way out of hand to the point where, in sometime in England, he's really kind of hitting rock bottom in terms of really trying to hammer a message when he just isn't even clear what kind of message he wants to send.
Now, aside from spirituality, another huge influence on George's music was his friends. We see some of the Monty Python cast make appearances in the music video for Crackerbox Palace, which is also directed by Eric Idle. George's song Faster was written because he was inspired by his racing driver friends Jackie Stewart and Niki Lauda. And in 1988, we saw the formation of the Traveling Wilburys with George, Jeff Lynne, Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, and Tom Petty. Why do you think George's friends played such a big role in his music?
Well, I think it's clear that George, and he said himself, he never wanted to be, the front man. He didn't like to be leading a thing or whatever it might be, an album, a band with his name at the front. He always felt uncomfortable with that. George loved being in a band. He loved being with friends, whether that be the Monty Python guys, whether that be the Dark Horse tour group. He liked to be able to kind of blend into the background and just let this community of musicians and artists create something together, which I think is wonderful. Whereas Paul doesn't mind being at the front. He very much is like, I'm Paul McCartney and you are my band. That's part of the major difference between those two artists. Whereas George didn't need that. He was absolutely fine to let someone else take center stage. But by virtue of him being the Beatle, everyone else wanted it to be him. So I think any time where you look at a period in George's life where there is that group of friends, where it is just him working with people, even if it's like his car racing friends in the late 70s, him just attending the Grand Prix in 1977, just literally going all around the globe and just wanting to be around guys that drive cars and like ask them about it. And like, where is your mind when you're in that position? He just has an innate curiosity for other people who are really good at something. And I think he just wanted to be around people who are good at those things and learn from them and be around them. And the Wilburys guys are like, that's that kind of final boss of a group of friends who are just there to not create anything necessarily groundbreaking or innovative, but just to get together and create music based on their early loves of how they fell into it, how they fell in love with it. And I think it's where you really see that kind of crystallize. Whereas, even just a few years later, when he's touring Japan, you notice that absence. He's got Eric Clapton there, but he doesn't have that group of people that are his buddies. I love Live in Japan, but there is something kind of safe and distant about it that you feel like if he had maybe a closer group of friends working on it, it might have a bit more panache. It might have a bit more punch to it. So, yeah, yeah. Rob?
That is such a beautiful way to put it. Honestly, you just kind of took my breath away. That sums up so much of George in just a few lines, but that really is true. He was someone who, it's funny that while everybody else on earth was fantasizing about being one of the Beatles, Everybody wanted to be one of the Beatles. George's ultimate fantasy was being in the band at Woodstock, right? Like, or joining Delaney and Bonnie like Eric Clapton did, just being anonymous guitar guy playing in the back with some like-minded musicians and letting somebody else up front take the heat. And because he was the Beatle, because he was so much more famous than anybody he could conceivably do that with, he could never live that fantasy because you could never just stand in the back and just be part of the band. That's why I think him encountering the Traveling Wilburys is one of the most beautiful things to happen in his life. It's really just an incredibly inspiring and beautiful musical story that it was the one band that George Harrison could join and just be a guy in the band, because he's in a group of peers who are A, very willing to take the spotlight, and B, like very like famous in their own rights, so that, you know, George wasn't even the most famous guy in the Traveling Wilburys to much of their audience. And so it was really kind of a beautiful thing. It's really beautiful that that band existed just for George to be in a thing where he could just, you know, be like, you know, extra guitarist in Derek and the Dominoes, or extra guitarist in the band. And, you know, or just being in Monty Python. You think about like how much he must have daydreamed about, you know, leaving music behind and just being, you know, like just, you know, the 6th or 7th or 8th Python, you know, and just, you know, having bit parts in their movies. He would have loved that. But instead, he was so famous, he had to settle for actually financing those movies. But it's a beautiful thing that he found the Wilburys. He found what he had needed really all his life, which is a place where he can sort of be one of the band without all the attention being focused on him. And that brought out so much of the beauty in his music, so much of the serenity in his music. He didn't have to try so hard all the time. He didn't have to take the spotlight when it didn't come naturally to him. That's why I think that those songs just, you know, stand out so hugely, and why that whole period stands out so hugely in his career.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, if you look at the Traveling Wilburys, their most famous songs, they're all taking turns singing the verses or chorus, or they're all singing at the exact same time. Like, none of them are really presenting themselves as the leader, which I think shows how having like-minded people around you really produces magical music. I mean, I might be biased because I really love every song by the Traveling Wilburys, though.
They hold up so well. They really, really age well. It's really funny to go back to those records, and everybody loved those records in the 80s, but they've really worn well because it's really, you understand what a weird isolated case in history this was, of a bunch of rock stars from different eras, different parts of the world, different musical styles, but they recognize something wounded in each other, and that by forming a band together, you know, that they can make each other stronger and bring out each other's best. It's really kind of a unique story.
And it's from a time where a lot of music has now not aged well. Part of the reason why, you know, there's a lot of good songwriting on Flowers in the Dirt and a lot of good songs on Paul McCartney's Flowers in the Dirt, but there are a lot of moments on that album that sound like garbage today, purely from the production and the awful synth bass, and, you know, and there's a bit of that in Cloud 9 with Jeff Lynne's stamp on it. But because the Wilburys weren't trying to innovate, they weren't trying to sound contemporary, it now has aged better than most other music from around that time, at least from an aging rocker perspective, you know?
Absolutely. I don't know if any of you're probably both too young to have been listening to the Traveling Wilburys in the 80s. But something that was really striking about that, I was a Dylan freak, and I remember that album and listening to, you know, the Dylan songs on that record, especially Tweeter and the Monkey Man, and thinking, he can still do this? Like, he can still write songs like this, because he hasn't done it on any of his own albums in many, many, many years. And it's like Dylan can still write funny, brilliant Dylan songs. And it's funny that was such a freeing environment for Dylan, because he didn't have to stand up and be, I'm Bob Dylan, I'm the prophet, I'm the spokesman of a generation, I'm the poet, we'll be winning the Nobel Prize someday. He's just like one guy in the band, and he can sing a couple songs per album. And for all of them in their different ways, it was so inspiring. You hear how much like mutual generosity goes into that arrangement. I mean, Tom Petty was more famous in 1989, 1988 than all those guys put together in terms of the music he was making right now. And it was just really kind of beautiful that he was at this peak in his career and that he, went from one group, the Heartbreakers, to this other group where other people were just so inspired by having a bigger star in the group. It's hard to describe. If you had a time machine and went back to 1988, the sheer weirdness of turning on Top 40 radio and hearing this song comes out and it's George Harrison, and then you hear Tom Petty and Bob Dylan singing the bridge, and then suddenly out of nowhere, Roy Orbison starts singing. It's like, what in God's name is happening here? It was absolutely unprecedented, unthinkable. It seemed like a novelty, but it holds up so brilliantly and so soulful because all those musicians thrived so much from not being in the spotlight.
And that it all happened by accident. It was, it was like a Jeff Lynne and Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison was singing on a song that Jeff Lynne was producing. And then they had Tom Petty, who needed to get his guitar as well. And then they thought they'd record it at Bob Dylan's house. Like, it was all just, George said it was maybe a full moon or something that when it happened, that you couldn't plan that. You couldn't ring up all those guys and be like, hey, take time out of your schedules, your touring schedules, your families, and come and make an album. The fact that it was happenstance is part of the magic of the Traveling Wilburys, I think, yeah.
So freaky and so fluky. Like, in an alternate universe, Bob Dylan is doing the dishes when they call to ask if they can come over to Malibu and use his place.
Yeah.
He doesn't get the call. None of this ever happens. And
Totally.
all those George songs, all those Dylan songs, they never happen because that serendipity doesn't happen. And like picking up a guitar at George's house, just completely nuts. Just the weird chain of coincidences of these people happening to be home and game for it at the same time.
Totally.
Now, if the Traveling Wilburys had had another member join their band for the next album after Roy Orbison passed away, which musician could you see possibly replacing that role?
You mean for Volume 3?
Yeah, for Volume 3.
Right. Oh, man. I don't know if you could replace Roy Orbison. I don't think anyone would have stepped up to the plate. How do you step into the shoes of the greatest voice, arguably, in popular music? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if it can be done.
Right.
Yeah. I'd have to think about that.
Maybe replace isn't the right word. Who could you see as just another Traveling Wilbury or someone who would fit into that band?
Something they could have done is had more Wilburys, have sort of a rotating cast. And it could have been, make an album every couple of years with whoever feels like doing it at that time. Part of me thinks it's really beautiful, given that it was the conceit of the fictional brothers that they stopped when there wasn't another, when Roy Orbison was gone. But part of me really thinks, I have to admit, I have a very specific scenario in my head where they call Ronnie Spector. And Ronnie Spector sings on Volume 3. She had a history with a few of them and to just sort of open up that band and just have, there's a Wilbury cousin coming in, there's a Wilbury sister, there's a Wilbury brother, and eventually bringing Wilbury nieces and nephews. It could still be going on today. And
I love that.
It's really beautiful that they stopped it when they did. But again, I have this alternate universe in my head where, and Ronnie Spector is quintessential case for somebody joining the Wilburys, right? She's somebody who's out there still trying to make her own music. The world isn't giving her enough attention. This is a place for her to, be part of a creative team.
Great answer.
Rob, in that scenario, it sounds like they could have used Paul McCartney's Let 'Em In as a nice theme song, Sister Susie Wilbury, Auntie Jan Wilbury.
That would have been that would have been a great way to drive George right out of the band.
Yeah.
Definitely wouldn't have worked out that well. So, which era of George's life do you find to be the most fascinating for you? I originally wanted to ask this question specifically about his post-Beatles life, but let's actually open it up to include his life in the Beatles as well. It could be musically, creatively, or just anything really that you're fascinated with.
I think musically, I really love the late 70s, the 33 and a third, and George Harrison era. But personally, I think there was something truly fascinating about the final years of George's life, where he knew he was going to die. And it's like this moment that he'd been preparing for his whole adult life, is, the act of leaving his body. And he knew that was coming. He was dealing with cancer. Someone tried to kill him, and at the same time, it's the millennium's just happened. The 21st century is at his doorstep with, all these changes are about to occur. He dies a couple of months after, or even just like a month after 9/11. Like I really wonder what George's take on the world. I guess that's Brainwashed. That's kind of literally the song Brainwashed. But I would love to know, in the last years of his life, the way George thought about all this stuff, how he then thought about the Beatles, without any kind of pretense of needing to make more music or needing to get back together with the Beatles or whatever it might be. I just think that George in his later years, I think, is the most fascinating, in the same way that I think if he lived on today, he would have only grown more fascinating, and with just he would have been a wonderful person to turn to in such dark times. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, like Elliot, I mean, you really you opened a pretty big door into how the world would be different and how George would have adapted if he'd had, many more years, as he deserved. And honestly, as we deserved. We deserved to have a lot more of George than we did. I think he would have had a great 2000s musically, the way Paul did and the way Ringo did. Like George passed away in late 2001. Paul comes back a few years later. I mean, he made other albums, but Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, like, to me, that kicks off one of the great runs that in the whole Beatles story. Paul, since Chaos and Creation, I mean, it's been just a mind-blowingly great 20-year time to be a Paul McCartney fan. And Ringo has made so many great songs. I mean, obviously he's been focusing largely on his calling as a band leader and as a live performer, but Ringo's made most of his best solo recordings in the past 15, 20 years. And if you're listening and you haven't checked them out, I'm not necessarily saying that, you're missing out on like gigantic musical genius, but like a lot of fun came into it for Ringo doing it in the 2000s and in 20 teens that wasn't necessarily there for him when he was trying to do it in the 80s. And I think George would have been part of that. I think he would have sort of relaxed into his senior statesman role the way that Paul and Ringo did. And I think he would have written really sarcastic, bitchy, nasty songs about the world as it was at that time. And quite frankly, I'm still always mourning that we didn't get to hear them, because they would have been really sarcastic, really bitchy, and really nasty. And they would have been, at least some of them would have been just really welcome artifacts from that time. But George's life had so many fascinating periods. I'm just going to go ahead and leave the Beatles behind, just because that's such a different story and feels like to me, the most interesting things about George are the things that he continued from that period. His religious experience, such a fascinating thing, because he converted so suddenly, and he found religion and adopted religion so suddenly in a way that would have made, well, given all our observations of human nature, that would suggest that it would be something that would burn out kind of fast. And that was something that became a more complex devotion as his life went on. To me, that's such a fascinating part of George's life, is his spirituality, his struggle to combine it with his music, that he has this ferocious musical genius, that he's got this intense religious devotion, and sometimes he can make them line up and they're in sync, and sometimes they clash in really discordant ways, both personally and artistically. And it's really fascinating to me that was a lifelong thing that expanded for him. I really feel like at the time that we lost George, obviously, it's like 20, 22 years, 23 years, and I'm still like really ticked off about losing George so young. but I feel like he had a lot more to give. And I feel like he, and especially, I mean, Olivia is such a fascinating figure in her own right, but like clearly, like, every fan has to be grateful for what Olivia brought to George's life in terms of musical inspiration and personal inspiration. So I feel in many ways like George as an old man would have been just a fascinating, cranky, belligerent, hostile, unpleasable, incorrigible, and frankly impossible character that I think we really, really would have enjoyed having him around.
Yeah, I often think that this is a big hypothetical, but if John and George had lived, how much John would have loved social media and Twitter, probably to a huge fault, but George would have despised it. George would have absolutely hated any kind of social media and what it would create. I mean, I don't know that for sure, obviously, but it just, to me, it seems like the things that George stood for were antithetical to the stuff that I think John would have just latched onto. Yeah, it's and instead we've got Paul McCartney's social media, which is so pristine and classy and so well put together, and then we've got Ringo's, which is low res images on his Twitter page or photos of his feet. And I think, honestly, we can be happy with that as well. That really speaks to those two guys. And to your point, Rob, I think it's also, speaking of George and John, how John was someone who, picked up like religion or way of life, almost like a fad that he would drop and absolutely, blast 1 year later. Whereas George was someone who found something when he was in his early 20s and he maintained it until the end of his life, which I think is just beautiful. Like, he never needed anything else. He reached the mountaintop and he was looking for what else there could be, and he found it and he never let it go. And I think that's really wonderful. And I would have loved to see elder statesman George. I think we were denied something really wonderful there. Yeah.
Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere roundtable discussion about the life and music of George Harrison, featuring Elliot Roberts and Rob Sheffield. I'm your host, Jack Lawless, and you're listening to part 3 of our conversation. If you haven't heard the first 2 parts, I definitely recommend checking those out before listening to this episode. Part 3 picks up after we just talked about the use of artificial intelligence in a new Beatles song being released this year, how George's music reflects his spirituality, and George's group of friends and their involvement in his life and music. I'd like to thank Elliot and Rob again for their enthusiasm, unmatched knowledge, and incredible opinions of amazing music. I hope you enjoy this episode. We're touching on a really interesting subject here. Have you both seen the 3-part Living in the Material World documentary about George from 2011? Because I think that documentary is kind of the closest thing we can get to knowing what George would be like in the modern day. Like, one of the coolest things about that documentary is that there's no narration, and you as the viewer are basically hearing about George's public and private life through the stories that his friends and family tell about him. I just think that it's kind of like the interview about his life and music in modern day context that he never had the chance to give.
We're all very lucky that we got such a loving and beautiful and very candid portrait of George that didn't sugarcoat him and really admirably tried to present the complete George without turning him into a sentimental figure and without overlooking some of the more difficult aspects of his life and his loved ones' lives. To me, just given who I am, given my personality, I'm so fascinated with his ongoing relationships with the Beatles. I'm fascinated. I learned a lot from that movie about his relationship with his family and his parents, who are such fascinating figures in his life story. But it's weird that the thing I come away from that movie most intensely with is just amazement at Olivia and like what a like fascinating figure she is in George's life. And just, I mean, every time I see Living in the Material World, I just think he was so lucky that, you know, that Olivia was there out there in the world. And, you know, she met him at a really dark and grim time of his life. You know, Elliot, it was his extra texture era, you know, like that was the music coming out of that. I love that album a lot more than you do, but it, like you said, it's a depressive album.
Yeah.
And just hearing just the light and life that she brought back into his music, into his art, but also into him and his spirit. And that he could go in a few years to an album as serene and beautiful as his 1979 self-titled album, which is honestly, it's an entire, that album is just one long love song to Olivia. That is like, no matter what's in the words of the songs or like the verbal content, that is an album that's clearly inspired by this intense and very personal love in his life that just, you know, audibly wasn't there on something like Dark Horse or Extra Texture. And there's something to me so inspiring and mysterious about Olivia as a character in George's life. And one of the ongoing weirdnesses of all the Beatles' lives is that they drew such brilliant and charismatic and fascinating women into their stories. Very, very different from any other male rock stars of their generation that we could name. But why go into that? But with Olivia, you have just such a genuinely heroic figure on her own right. And it's just, it's wild that to me is like the great takeaway of that movie is really the love story between them.
Yeah, I would agree with you absolutely. It's so wonderful to hear her point of view and to hear how, like in the song Dark Sweet Lady, like she clearly did rescue him, you know? And that documentary highlights that perhaps he could have been a better husband to her, but she was someone who was central to his life from the mid-70s onwards. And I think, yeah, what a blessing to them both that they found each other. And I think it's not Niki Lauda, one of the car racing guys in the documentary says that he considered George to be one of his very good, like, just personal friends. But to George, who had so many friends, it you know, you couldn't necessarily count on that he would say the same thing, because his world, his community, and just the scope of the friends that he had was just so huge. But everyone dearly cherished that friendship that they had with George. Everyone who, Klaus Voormann said he was the best friend I ever had. And it just appeared to me that if you were fortunate enough to come into George's life and for him to come into yours, that it was a relationship that was unlike anything else you'd have. You know, he was someone who was genuinely curious about you and asked about your life, your family, and he remembered things about you. And to see how moved people were, even, you know, people like Roy Cooper and that kind of thing, just so moved by this man and what he did and what he was capable of, and the joy he brought into people's life. That was my kind of favorite takeaway from the documentary, because George would never, you know, sing his own praises. He was, you know, often quite grumpy, really. When you look at any kind of George interview, it's an air of, why am I here? We're doing this right now. Why am I gardening?
I'm so glad you guys aren't like that.
Yeah,
That would make this podcast very different.
Oh, this has made my week, absolutely. But yeah, it's the impact George had on other people, whoever they were, other musicians, race car drivers, movie stars, is that they all found him to be such a special guy. So yeah, that is really what I love about it. And the fact that it's like all the Dark Horse tour footage that we have is from that documentary. And I'm imploring whoever is in charge of that to do something more with it, because I think that there is a potential to rewrite the history of the Dark Horse tour. So many people love that tour who went to it. And I think that there's enough. Danny Harrison has said that there's enough footage there to create something truly worthwhile. And I would just personally love to see that as a bit of a side note to what we're just talking about. Yeah.
I love that idea. I hope that happens. I hope that
Oh
happens.
yeah.
I don't know whether to love it or fear it, but like I can't wait to hear it. Elliot, you really hit the nail on the head that George had that effect on such a wide variety of people who had really nothing else in common. You know, you've got comedians and race car drivers and movie stars, all these people, and yet George had that effect on them. One of the images of George that's really like kind of indelible from that movie is just the image of him driving around with all these ukuleles in his trunk. And that so many people have stories of like, yeah, George opened up the trunk of his car and like pulled out a ukulele and gave me one. And it's so funny that is such a beautiful sort of metaphor for George's presence in the world of bringing, you know, ukuleles into the lives of these people who are all, it seems, really touched and also somewhat puzzled by this gift. But like the fact that his charisma translated to all these different people. I'm so fascinated by the race car drivers in that, and also in George's life in general, because that's something I know nothing about, and I have absolutely no ability at all to process why that was so intense for George and why he loved that so much and why he idolized these people so much. I mean, it's really kind of funny, like how much even like, you know, his 1979 self-titled album is an album that's very much like, he's very much a racing fan who's very smitten by that world and really starstruck, which, you know, seems to me really like kind of like funny and lopsided. You know, like George Harrison is George Harrison, you know, like why aren't they just like dropping to the ground and cowering that, you know, the guy who wrote I Want to Tell You came to see them race a car. But there's something kind of beautiful in that. And I do love that.
Yeah, he talks about that briefly in I Me Mine, how, you know, antithetical it seems that someone like him, spiritual, you know, a lover of nature, is also into race cars, noisy polluters, you know, that kind of thing. But it's just his love, I guess, he had as a kid with cars that just carried through. And he does mention how to get to that position where you're the best at what you're doing, driving those cars in such a dangerous environment, that there is a link between, you know, meditation and what he does to allow his mind to, you know, to be at peace and to truly be present, that he saw a similarity with what those race car drivers have to do when they're in that position, and everything has to, you know, move on instinct, and there's no thought. It's you're almost accessing a higher plane of your consciousness. And I think that, if anything, was the link between what George, who he was and what he did, and between these guys. But I think you could get anyone who was good at something or the best at something, and you could put them in front of George and they could talk for hours about that. I think it was just it's George's genuine curiosity about the world and about people who were good at stuff. Yeah.
So how do you both feel about the world's current retrospective view of George Harrison as a person and as a musician? Do you think that there's anything we should collectively reevaluate or bring more or less attention to? Rob, I know that you just wrote an incredible article that sheds new light on George's album Living in the Material World 50 years later. What do you think?
I feel we all had that love for that 1979 self-titled album. That's an album that for all three of us, it means a lot to us. Blow Away is a phenomenal song. You know, it can hold its own with any single, any hit single that any of the Beatles ever released after the band broke up. And yet, for so many people who love George and love a lot of his music, this is a great unknown period of his career, the 70s in general, the 70s after All Things Must Pass. It's almost like this curtain comes down after All Things Must Pass, and then it rises again for Cloud Nine. And there's a lot going on in that period that is really fascinating. I think there's a lot more to discover, and I think George's stock as a singer-songwriter and band leader will just keep rising because people will go back and hear those records. And admittedly, some of those records, like I said, I happen to love Extra Texture. I'm not trying to change your mind about it because everything you say about it is true. But there is, I think we've seen this happen with Paul, certainly. We've seen this happen with John and with Ringo, that albums that they made in the 70s that sort of got lost in the historical shuffle for a while have been rediscovered. I mean, I remember many, many, many years when everybody agreed that Ram was an absolute piece of garbage. There was no pro-Ram narrative. This was a thing, it was just kind of a consensus viewpoint. It was like one of those pieces of conventional wisdom that nobody challenged. It was only really about 20 years ago that people began sort of reevaluating Ram and listening to it with fresh ears without the prejudices. Same kind of thing for McCartney too, like it wasn't a reviled album, but it was nowhere near as famous 15, 20 years ago as it is now, nowhere near as loved. And for George, I think that his 70s period is kind of like that. I feel like people will go back and find these songs from Extra Texture, from 33 and a Third, from George Harrison, and even maybe Life Itself from somewhere in England. And people will rediscover and reevaluate these songs, and they'll realize that George made a lot more great music than people even understand at this point. We're still kind of catching up with his achievement. Certainly in terms of those, we were talking about the demos from All Things Must Pass that, they're out there, they're released, people can hear them, but a lot of people who love George Harrison just, haven't heard songs like Cosmic Empire or Dara Dune, and, they would almost certainly love them.
And it speaks to the quality of those songs as well, that on Living in the Material World, apart from Try Some, Buy Some, which he'd been toying with for a few years, he didn't use any of them. He didn't feel the need to bring any of them into that next album, and he could have, and they're great songs. But it's why I've made these super long ranking videos of,
which are so great, and I learned so much from them. Oh my God, I love them.
Oh, thank you so much. That really genuinely means a lot. But it's beginning with Paul, because he just has such a large amount of albums that are not heard of. You ask people about Paul McCartney's, solo career, they bring up Band on the Run, or, perhaps one or two others, but there's just so much. And so and the same goes with George. What I want to achieve with those videos is I want to go in as much depth as possible to evaluate, analyze, and kind of discuss this music, because they're the Beatles. They may not be together, but they're still making incredible music that no one talks about. You don't hear on the radio. You don't hear them discussed in retrospectives, because for whatever reason, people just didn't deem the four Beatles separately as anything really worthwhile, aside from, a couple of hit albums. But it really warms my heart now when people go, people comment and they say, like, I'm the biggest Paul McCartney fan now because of that video. You've introduced me to, whatever it might be, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. You've introduced me to Walls and Bridges, or George Harrison's self-titled. That's now my favorite album, because I truly think they are just the world is sitting on a treasure trove with these songs and these albums that we just haven't gone back to listening to. But I think people always will go back to them, and they'll discover that they may never be the Beatles, but nothing ever will be. But you can really, really enjoy some excellent music, particularly in all their respective 70s solo careers. Yeah.
Yeah, and after you take them out of that narrative that the world sort of built of this sort of disappointment after the Beatles, and you just listen to the music as music, just so many brilliant songs that don't fit into that narrative just come to the surface. A friend of mine has a son who is 8 years old, and he thinks the very best Beatles song of all is Blow Away. And he's 8 years old. He does not have the sort of narrative of like, no, they were the Beatles, and then they broke up, and then they allegedly hated each other, and they went into decline. And of course, you listen to Blow Away, and it's like, it is that good. It is that great. After, if you talk about this, I did a Beatles panel last year, and someone came to the panel and came afterwards to talk about the music. And as it turned out, he was Russ Tittleman. And I was like, oh my gosh, well, that George Harrison album you produced is one of my very favorites. And he was very, very generous in talking about that period. And I said, I was just having a conversation with a friend who thinks the very best song that the Beatles did was Blow Away. And, and Russ was like, who's to say he's wrong? And, it's really true. that there's so much of the story that's just beginning to be told and just beginning to be understood.
Yeah, wow. Just going in on that for a second, did Russ enjoy his time producing the self-titled?
Yes, and had very many warm memories of George. It was honestly like a little daunting because we were talking for George for a bit before he said like his name, and I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, so many. So I said, like I've been listening to your records like my entire life, and it was funny that one is such a special album in terms of George's discography, in terms of his music. As you discussed brilliantly, he's very happy and peaceful on that album in a way that people don't think of usually when they think of George Harrison. And he's very pop and very show busy in the best way on that album. And it's a very 1979 LA rock record. It is very slickly, cleverly, thoughtfully put together. And it's funny that there's still so much of the story. If the world is just now really catching up with that album, I feel like there's lots of great George music that people are just going to keep catching up with.
I think if that album was released today, it would like instantly go to number one.
You're not wrong.
But
yeah.
I can't believe Not Guilty is on that album.
Oh my God, yes. There's somebody that was Not Guilty on that one and Circles on that one. And it's funny that he didn't, I wish he'd kept that going in the 90s, kept making albums and put, like Sour Milk Sea on them or something like that.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about what you said about Circles at the end of Gone Troppo, and that really does seem like the one to put on at the end of the party when like the guests won't leave.
Oh yeah.
Like, okay,
absolutely.
People. It's funny that we haven't talked so far at all about Wonderwall music or electronic sound. Wonderwall music is one that when people hear it, which they can now because it's on streaming, whereas it was unfindable for most of my lifetime. It's funny that people hear it now and they're really always surprised like that there's so much good stuff on it.
Oh, so good. That's, I think you pointed out just then why I think a lot of this has gone, people don't know about this stuff because it's very hard to access this back catalog of sometimes, like finding a copy of Gone Troppo anywhere would have been very difficult. But in the age of streaming, anyone can go and listen to any obscure B-side or, Wonderwall. And I think that's going to be a big step in people rediscovering this music is the accessibility to it. Sure, it's, as Bob Dylan says, it smooths everything out, and we can argue whether that's good or bad, but it's for the younger generation, there's no barriers to that, and they can enjoy whatever they want to in whatever capacity. But yeah, Wonderwall music is, I watched that film only for the first time this year, and the film, definitely is just an okay film, made out of 60s, late 60s, young artists' utopic vision of the world. But George's attempt, a successful attempt, I would say, at incorporating classic Indian music with rock music, kind of doing it the most on that album more than any of his other albums, is really just a testament to his talents at the time. He'd never scored a film, didn't know the first thing about it, and just sets such a great tone. It's the best thing about the film, that and the occasional great visuals, which are paired wonderfully with the stuff he created in Mumbai in 1968. I love Wonderwall music.
I can forgive a lot about a film that has Jane Birkin in it.
Yeah, exactly.
A very lenient jury in that case. But that's definitely a great case of an album that was unfindable for many years, and people sort of adopted a sort of stereotype about what they assumed that it sounded like. And we can see this with, all their solo careers, that there's examples abound that now people can hear them and they can come to them fresh without those sort of pre-baked narratives that people used to impose on these. But it used to be, if you even heard Wonderwall music, it was because you went to the ends of the earth to find it. You probably paid too much and you listened to it and it was, not as brilliant as you secretly hoped it would be. Now that anybody can listen to it for pretty much free, it's a thing where its virtues are very noticeable in a way that they were obscured for many years.
Yeah, I don't know if we can say the same thing about electronic sound, but the fact that it was an early example of synthesizers used in, I guess, popular music, there's something to that. But otherwise, yeah, I've got a friend who's really into quite obscure sounds. He's just the weirder the music, the better, and he comes out to bat for electronic sound, but I don't know. I think there's something of a contrarian mindset if you consider electronic sound to be a listenable album.
Someday
Maybe you disagree.
someday somebody will sample it in a brilliant song, and then
Of
that will
course,
make it a whole new album. So
totally.
I
I
I just
fully
have that
expect that.
operate. I'm waiting for that person. I'm slightly impatient because I wish they do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Could you imagine that the new Beatles song that's coming out is just an excerpt from Electronic Sound?
I love that. And nobody would know. Like it would take, yeah, nobody would know.
Yeah.
Honestly, like
True.
the new Beatles song, it could be from something from side 2 of Extra Texture, and it would take weeks for anybody to notice.
Absolutely.
Another great topic that you guys just mentioned is streaming. Like for the last 10 years, the main way that I consumed music is through streaming. And as of recent, the algorithm in these streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music, it's just been getting better and better for suggesting songs to you that you haven't heard before based on what you listen to most. And and honestly, if not for the ability to stream music and select songs at will and be recommended deep cuts from albums that I haven't listened to all the way through yet, my music knowledge would be way more limited than it is now.
Oh no, absolutely. It's why we don't have any excuse now. Like if you want to go back and listen to an artist's back catalog, someone like Paul McCartney, which was previously to streaming would have been a lifelong task to gather all those albums. You can do it in a couple of days if you're really committed enough. And I do wonder what that's going to do to music journalism, to the way we consume music now as well. I really hope that the album is not, that's not going away. I think people thought that there was a threat to that when like iTunes first came about. Like, are we even going to do albums anymore? Or are people just going to pay, for songs individually? But I think there are still artists, obviously, that really make a thing of an album release. Taylor Swift is clearly one of them, who just is a master of creating an identity and era around, like a set of songs. And I'm glad that artists like that still exist, because I think that's very important. I think there's really something to receiving an album and looking at the liner notes and the in jokes that you don't get if you do just stream. So I think a healthy balance of streaming, of record collecting is how I approach my music. I still listen to vinyl records, if I want to just sit down and take in an album, look at the artwork. I still do that, but I will admit that most of them are the way that I hear my music is through streaming. But yeah, staying cognizant of it, I think, is important.
Totally.
Definitely. I mean, it's funny that people take albums more seriously than ever, because artists just love like the album as statement. And
Yeah.
It's funny that audiences really respond to that, because George in the 70s especially made albums where not necessarily listening all the way through is the best way to appreciate the peaks and valleys on these records. So the idea that something like streaming makes it easy to just, pick like the good song off this album or the good song off that album, just to focus in on individual songs, and sort of free them from the context of the record and the reputation of the record and the narrative of the record. And, that's what makes these songs. I think that's why George's stock just keeps rising. I think it's why, for all the Beatles as solo artists, their reputations are just going to keep rising as the world just, now is able to go and listen to what they did in a really easy kind of way. It used to be that if you were telling people, Elliot, you mentioned Walls and Bridges, which is a record that has such great stuff on it. It used to be that if you recommended that somebody give that album, that music a chance, the commitment that required of them to, actually find a copy of the album and to sit down with it and wade through some of the stuff that's maybe not so great, or, to get acclimated to the production or whatever it is that for different people, it's different things. But the greatness that's on that record is now much more easily accessed than ever. Like somebody can just listen to Old Dirt Road, just on its own as an individual song and say, this is one of the most beautiful things John Lennon ever did. And, that is something that is, or all those songs, on Mind Games, which is a great album with like really extreme highs and extreme lows. And I love that now people can just focus on the highs and discover music that would have been just too daunting to discover before.
Yeah.
Well, Elliot and Rob, I saved the hardest question for last. If you could characterize George Harrison in one word, which word would that be?
I would say bliss. I thought about this, and he's used the phrase blissed out a few times. The first time he went to the tropics, it was his kind of way of labeling what would become what he felt when he meditated, and when he got closer to God, it was bliss. And I think he created bliss in his music. For me, as a listener, anyway, I think George spent his life trying to find bliss in gardening, in traveling to a far distant Hawaiian island. That's what he sought out of life. He wanted to find that upper layer of consciousness where he could experience that. So, and I think it's, a kind of positive word. I think there's a lot of kind of, I suppose, grumpy could be one or whatever. But I think when you really look at what George sought to do in his life, it was to find bliss. So that's the word I would choose.
I like that.
That's a great choice. Mine would be serenity. And because it's not a mood that George was in a lot of the time, but it's his music achieves serenity in a way that no other music I know does, both with the Beatles and afterwards. That you listen to a song like Give Me Love, which is my very favorite George Harrison solo song, and I think always will be. And the simplicity of that song, the friendliness of it, even just the tone, that this is a song where he's not claiming to have all the cosmic answers, and it's not a song where he's lecturing people about their sinful ways. It's a song where he's using his special connection to God to put in a word for the rest of us. He's offering a generous prayer for humanity. And you can hear in his guitar that the serenity that he achieves with these simple goals. I think of George as very much like Buddy Holly in so many ways. Obviously one of his early heroes, but that's something that Buddy Holly had as well too, that when Buddy Holly found that sort of serenity in his voice and his guitar and his sense of rhythm, that everything else fell into place and his music just became overwhelmingly beautiful without necessarily getting overwhelmingly complicated. And because I love so many George songs where he's cranky, kvetchy, where he's basically like Larry David with a guitar. There's an awful lot of that. I think George Harrison and Larry David would have been great friends if George had continued into this era. I even have this fantasy of them making an album together where like Larry David is doing the vocals and George is playing the guitar, and they could collaborate in lyrics. Honestly, like, picture Larry David doing, I look at the floor, I see it needs sweeping, like
it's so true.
George's old man sensibility, which we were talking about before, but there's a certain beautiful serenity that comes out. And the album that we've been talking about all night, that 1979 self-titled album, too bad it didn't have a title, or we could, call it something, but it's really beautiful that of all his albums, this is the one that he called George Harrison, that there's a serenity there, whether it's a song like Dark Sweet Lady or a song like Here Comes the Moon, or a song like Blow Away, where he sounds really effortless, like he's not pushing too hard, even though we know how much genius and how much torment and how much striving and how much yearning went into these songs. That what comes out is a kind of serenity that I know of no other music that captures that quality so well. And that he was able to make music that just communicates that serenity, even in times that were really dark, painful, chaotic for him. Jack, you mentioned Deep Blue, which is a song that is obviously a very deeply brokenhearted song. And yet there's a buoyancy in the guitar to that song that carries him from one end of the song to the other. And you just try to imagine anybody else in music being able to write a song like Deep Blue, and you just can't do it. Like, George has this ability to create serene music out of very unserene circumstances. And that to me is the essence of George Harrison's genius.
Great answer.
Yeah. The word that I chose to characterize George was honest. Like, if you go through his entire catalog, I feel like all of his songs are just an exact reflection of where he's at in his life at that moment. And like you said earlier in the conversation, Rob, I feel like his throat is like a consciousness. And when he's singing a song that he doesn't want to sing, it'll be very evident. And Elliot, like you said, on Somewhere in England, he comes out of the gate criticizing the music that his fans are listening to. He can't help it. I mean, there's no shot that he could be like Paul in that sense. And, forgive the pun here, but he can't put on My Brave Face and be a crowd pleaser.
Oh, yeah.
And another word I thought of in relation to George is the word you, because that's a word that appears on at least one song in, I believe, nearly every single one of his albums. But the meaning of you in George's songs always changes depending on where he is at that point in his life. You could be either God, it could be the listener, it could be his wife, or the general world at some points.
What a beautiful choice.
Well put.
Those are both great choices. I love how you cheated and had two different words, but they're both really just like apt. It's really amazing that but George, an artist with so many contradictions, but all these selections for words are really like fascinating because they bring his contradictions together.
Yeah.
Bliss is such a part of it, when he was so drawn to conflict and darkness. I love George singing "Beware of Darkness." When he's to a large extent the darkness in the music at that point. But there's so much contradiction in George, and that he was able to make so much music out of it.
I mean, he points that out in Brainwashed, in the song Pisces Fish. That he is a Pisces. He's like, I think the lyric is, I'm full of life's contradictions or something like that. I'm going where the other half's just been. I don't even know what that actually like fully means, but like, I like that in his final album, he was truly aware of his contradictions and how much, certain beliefs or certain actions were at a complete contradiction to all other aspects of his life. And I think that's ultimately one of the most fascinating things about George Harrison, is how he, tackled being one of the most famous people on earth, beloved and so talented, with being someone who wanted to shed his ego and, not fall into the trappings of the material world. That tension with himself and with the greater world around him is, to me, the most fascinating thing about the man. And I'm glad he kind of reckoned with it with his final songs. Yeah.
Jack, I'm wondering if I Me Mine is a favorite of yours, the book.
I actually haven't read I Me Mine yet. It's on my list and I really want to read it, but I haven't gotten around to it yet.
It's not a super long read. It looks very thick now, but it's quite an abridged version of his life, and then primarily it's his own notes on his songs, which is endlessly fascinating to hear him kind of discuss his own music. But you can honestly read it in like a day. So yeah, I'd recommend it.
It's a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. It's funny, the book is most famous for like John having a tantrum that not being mentioned in it, which is so perfect in a way that I love. Like George actually has this really beautiful and revealing and very funny memoir, and it's most famous because it hurt John's feelings. There's something so perfect about the prison that George was in, like in terms of how the world saw him.
Yeah,
all his complaints are validated in just that one image.
Yeah, truly.
Another song, I'm just curious, what you guys, I mean, I assume this is a favorite of yours, but it's such a weird sort of, and yet like famous George song, and it hasn't come up yet, but like, Isn't It a Pity? Which is,
oh yeah,
it's funny that that's a song that is, you know, we think of that as such a like gigantic classic George song, and it's so weird and so contradictory, and I feel like we're all still sort of figuring that one out.
Yeah, and the fact that it was from 1966 as well, that he wrote something like that at such a young age. It's mind-blowing. It's scary to think about, really. Yeah, that he had such a grasp on the world, and that he could, I suppose, summarize, you know, the depth of his despair of what he sees as what's going wrong in the world, and isn't it a pity? But it can also fill you with such hope, the way the finished version just swells at the end, and it leaves you with this kind of strange, I guess, contradictory state, like George himself, that there is hope, that those strings underneath, you know, give you that sense that maybe there's a way out of this, maybe that there's a way that we can overcome the things that George finds such a pity in the world. Yeah. I mean, like, we could honestly have used up all 2 hours and 23 minutes talking about any one song off of All Things Must Pass. Truly, there is so much more about George that I would have loved to dive into, because there is so much there. It's almost insurmountable.
Yeah, what a great song. One of my favorite moments in the Get Back documentary is when they showed George quitting the band, and they played his demo of Isn't It a Pity over that whole sequence.
Really affecting.
It was really impactful, yeah. And Elliot, you're right. You know, I'm kind of surprised that we haven't talked about All Things Must Pass like half as much as we discussed Gon Trapo.
Because they're the unsung heroes. We all know All Things Must Pass. People will talk about that album as if it's the only George Harrison solo album. So I felt personally that, despite it being, you know, one of the greatest of all time, it didn't necessarily need more praise being heaped on it, because people have. It's, you know, we're here to sing the praises of his self-titled. That's what this podcast has been about, and I'm glad we did.
Yes, yeah.
It is funny. It's just occurring to me now that, like, we barely talked about, you know, it's probably the album we've talked about least. We talked more about Wonderwall music than about All Things Must Pass. It's kind of perfect in a way.
Totally.
That's how you know you're with true George Harrison fans.
Absolutely.
And he wouldn't have it any other way.
But honestly, Apple Scruffs, what a song. He could have retired the day after he did Apple Scruffs, and like, that would still be a classic career.
I think it's my favorite backup singing on any solo Beatle song is Apple Scruffs. The George O'Hara Smith singers, the way they just get full girl group pop perfection on that song is just, it's just wonderful.
Incredible.
Oh, and the song that George left off the original album of All Things Must Pass, I Live For You, with Pete Drake on that amazing pedal steel guitar. I mean, when I listen to that song, I definitely feel both blissful and serene.
What George called the bagpipes of country and western music.
Yeah.
Did he really?
Pete Drake's pedal steel guitar. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But yeah, like blissful, serene, and you.
Exactly.
And that could be an album in itself. And that's, again, the funny that he had this stockpile of songs after All Things Must Pass. And as Elliot pointed out, like, he didn't milk these. You know, he's still recording White Album outtakes, you know, into the 70s and 80s. He's still doing, you know, like Circles and Not Guilty. And he's letting I Live For You just sit there all these years. It's really kind of comical.
And Rob, I know that you brought up earlier Gopala Krishna. I mean, oh man, like that song.
What a song. What a song. And so much of what he tried to do in so many bigger sounding songs, he did so many like elaborate productions, and that's just him and his guitar, and he absolutely nails everything he set out to do. It's honestly weird to think how the world might be different and how the world's idea of George might be different if he had just found a way to put this song on a damn album at some point. in the 70s, like when he's struggling to fill up some of his albums. And it's like, wow, just put that one on a B-side, like what a song that is.
So Elliot and Rob, what are you both up to now in terms of working on projects? Elliot, I have to ask you the inevitable question here, and it's not when will the bubble burst, but will you release a video of you ranking all of Ringo's solo albums?
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much I'm waiting for that one.
Well, yeah, this is the thing. I wasn't necessarily going to do it because there's just I think he even has a couple more than Paul. And I was like, do people want to hear this? Is this going to be substantial? But now I know I have to do it. And so it won't be out till next year. I can really only average one of those videos a year because they are massive. They are such a huge undertaking. But I will do it. I will do Ringo's discography and perhaps even the Beatles after that. So that's down the pipeline. And otherwise, you can find me on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Elliot Roberts videos, or just search Elliot Roberts in YouTube. I'll pop up for all your Beatles fan video needs.
May I recommend for any of the newbies out there to start with the Paul solo stuff, which is so... when you hear Elliot talk about it, it really like jumps out at you how little real, like genuinely illuminating critical attention has been paid to Paul's solo career. It's almost like hiding in plain sight, as so much Beatles solo stuff is. But honestly, like hearing you talk about chaos and creation in the backyard was a finally kind of thing. Because like it's, absolute classic that completely turns around the Paul McCartney story. And so many people like just completely forget that exact album is even part of the Paul McCartney story because they'd already decided what the story was. I'm looking forward to the Ringo one.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, look, I would agree. If you do want to start anywhere with me, start at that video. I think it'll give you a great insight to what I'm all about. And Rob, that was an honor to hear you to hear you say that. Thank you so much, because your writing is such a huge influence. Truly, like starting my YouTube channel was partly because of that book that you wrote. So thanks so much for what you do as well. And, I look forward to inevitably when Paul McCartney makes a new album, your review of it on Rolling Stone.
And it's wild that he keeps making those albums. And I keep saying, I don't get how he can still write these songs, but it's like absolutely incredible that, he's got, now it's the 2020s and it's like, who else has written brilliant songs in the 1950s and the 2020s? Well, you've got Smokey Robinson, Paul McCartney, and that's the list.
That's about it.
It's really just kind of incredible that his will to keep making music and his brilliance at keeping making music. And but we could have a whole just like recent Paul episode, that's like
totally
no 20th century Paul allowed. Just we're going to pretend Driving Rain is a debut album. But thanks for everything you do, Elliot, because it is genuinely fascinating, and I do recommend anyone like starting with the Paul ones. Like those are the bangers.
Thank you, Rob.
The video that I'd recommend watching by Elliot is Why Ram Should Be Considered the First Indie Pop Album. I love that video.
I love that one.
Oh yeah, well. Thank you. That was like my second video that I made. I think if I would touch up a few things back there. I think the depth of my research wasn't as extensive these days, but I still stand by that video. I do love it. And look, if anything, if it introduces you to the album of Ram, then it's worth it, because apart from All Things Must Pass, that's for me my favorite solo Beatles record. It's just a magical record, that one. Yeah.
And I'd just like to thank you both for coming on this podcast and spending 2.5 hours with me talking about George Harrison. You guys are the only people I know that would do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
It's a
Jack.
pleasure.
Honestly, Jack, thank you for what you do with all of these. Like, it's amazing, like how many great Beatles minds I get to discover from your work. And you are always so brilliant in these. I just thank you for everything you do.
Oh, thank you.
I'm constantly learning from your podcasts and your guests, but more often you. I hope that's okay to say.
Thank you, Rob. That's so great to hear.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you guys. I would be happy to do it again anytime.
Awesome.
Well, we'll try a verse of this one. I've been traveling on a boat and a plane.
Thank you for listening to the Here, There, and Everywhere three-part discussion about George Harrison's life and music, featuring Elliot Roberts and Rob Sheffield. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Both Elliot and Rob's information and pages are linked in the podcast description, so be sure to check out their pages and their work in case you haven't already. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe to this podcast to hear more roundtables like this in the future and more interviews with creative people who were influenced by the Beatles. Of course, thank you to George Harrison for a lifetime of songs, thoughts, and discussions to be had about the blissful serenity of his music. And as always, we'll see you next week with a brand new episode.
Any road will take you there. I keep traveling around the bend. There is no beginning, there is no end. It wasn't born and never dies. There are no edges, there is no sides. Ah yeah, you just don't win. It's so far out, the way out is in. Bow to God and call him sir, but if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Sort of.